One email, one phone call from the BBC to the parents who complained about alleged payments from a famous presenter. Does that sound like comprehensive safeguarding practice? As further allegations against the presenter emerge tonight, we'll ask where this crisis goes next. And there are further questions for The Sun, including why will no one from the newspaper talk to us? Today, the BBC's Director General did speak.
These are clearly damaging to the BBC. It's not a good situation.
Also tonight, the government faced down MPs who wanted to dilute its illegal migration bill. But could there be more challenges to come? We'll talk to a Conservative former minister who wants Downing Street to compromise. And in the last few minutes, the government has said the G7 is going to announce, quote, a significant international framework for Ukraine's long-term security arrangements at the NATO summit tomorrow. Will President Zelensky be satisfied with that for now? We'll talk to his former defence minister. Good evening. As we came on air last night, we tried to be really clear with everyone watching, you, about the limits to what we actually know as fact in the ongoing crisis that's engulfed the BBC and one of its leading presenters. Today, following an intervention from the BBC Director General, Tim Davie, and a publication of a timeline of the organisation's interaction with the parents of a person allegedly paid for sexually explicit pictures by the presenter, it's fair to say we have answers to at least some of the big questions. But in their place swept in several new ones about the pace of the BBC's response to the complaint made to it in May. About the conduct of the presenter, who's facing new allegations in a report from BBC News colleagues into allegedly menacing messages he sent to a person in their early 20s on a dating app. About the journalism of The Sun, which sticks by its story, despite an attack on it by the young person at its heart. And tonight, about just how long the anonymity of the presenter can hold, with some high-profile BBC colleagues coming out in the last few hours to call for him to identify himself. We'll discuss all of this in a moment and make sense of where it leaves us. First, here's Seema.
Some of the WhatsApp messages from staff at the BBC, as it continues to be the focus in the media and beyond. And to convey the scale of the crisis facing the organisation, today the Prime Minister even waded in.
Well, obviously they're very serious and concerning allegations, and that's why I'm pleased that the Culture Secretary spoke to the Director General of the BBC over the weekend and is confident that the BBC is investigating this both rigorously and rapidly. I think that's the right course of action.
Some of the malicious stuff online, I would condemn, of course.
While the Director General said he couldn't get into specifics about the complaint due to privacy reasons, and that the police had asked the BBC to pause its investigation while it looked into what happened. He admitted the allegations had been difficult.
These are clearly damaging to the BBC. It's not a good situation. But I think there's a few things as Director General I care deeply about. One is the ability for our newsroom to report independently, without fear or favour.
The interview with him was carried out in the early afternoon. A few hours later, more serious allegations were made about the presenter. According to journalists within BBC News, he sent a person in their 20s menacing and abusive messages after meeting them on a dating app. The presenter hasn't responded to the allegations. Some staff were quick to react. This comes less than 24 hours after a lawyer's letter on behalf of the young person at the heart of the story in The Sun was sent to the BBC, saying the allegations were rubbish. This is a fast-paced story, constantly changing as new information comes to light. Now, fresh allegations have arguably put this place under more pressure to answer some more crucial questions. Had anyone heard of any similar allegations? And if so, what action was taken? Today, the BBC executive provided some new information about the initial complaint, making clear that it tried to contact the complainant twice over several weeks after receiving it. Now it faces criticism about why it didn't try harder to reach them when the complaint was of a serious nature. The Sun says it remains to be understood why the allegations weren't escalated and the presenter was not spoken to at the time, while the BBC says it has processes and protocols for receiving information and managing complaints when they are first made. We always take these matters extremely seriously and seek to manage them with the appropriate duty of care. It's a complex picture, but it's been another tough day for the BBC as it continues to fight to preserve its reputation as the mouthpiece for honesty and transparency.
The tweet, it will just... Right, Seema, it's been another tricky day for some, hasn't it?
Well, yes, as we just heard from those WhatsApp messages, there are people in this building feeling perturbed, feeling disturbed, feeling like, when is this going to end? Today we've heard from the Director General of the BBC, the first time since these allegations were reported in the Sun newspaper, saying perhaps there are lessons to be learnt about protocols and processes in place at the moment. He will indeed be feeling a lot of pressure this evening because with each twist and turn, more uncomfortable questions are being asked. Who heard what when? Why did it take several weeks for the organisation to speak to the presenter? Now, as more allegations have come to light, there is also further pressure on the naming of the presenter. The Sun's front page, yet again, has another story about him making further allegations. And Jeremy Vine has tweeted today saying, "I'm starting to think the BBC presenter involved in the scandal should now come forward publicly. These new allegations will result in yet more vitriol being thrown at perfectly innocent colleagues of his." He went on to say the BBC was on its knees with this issue. It's also important to say, Victoria, that the presenter at the centre of this hasn't said anything so far, and neither have his lawyers. As I said in that report that we just saw, this is a very fast-moving story, and I think there is a danger that as the BBC deals with legal and privacy issues, it risks the perception to its critics that the organisation is a slow-moving bureaucracy in the face of serious allegations, something the Director General tried to put into context earlier today.
Are we going to have a clip? Or not?
No clip.
No
No
clips.
clip.
Okay,
For the
sorry,
Director
that's my mistake. I'm so sorry.
No problem.
Thank you very much, Seema.
Thank you
very much. We're going to talk now to Harvey Proctor, who is a former Conservative MP and who had his home raided by the Metropolitan Police following false claims by the fantasist Carl Beach. Also here is the journalist and legal expert Joshua Rosenberg. Welcome, both of you. Joshua Rosenberg, first of all, BBC News has reported a second person in their 20s who claims they felt threatened and scared by the presenter. The Sun has tonight reported claims the presenter allegedly broke lockdown rules to meet someone from a dating site. What difference do these further claims, if they're true, make?
This morning we had complainant 1, this afternoon we had complainant 2, this evening we have complainant 3. Who knows what we're going to get tomorrow? It's much easier to dismiss one complaint than it is to dismiss 2 complaints, than it is to dismiss 3 complaints. And so this certainly does put pressure on the BBC presenter to respond.
Why?
Because the allegations are harder to dismiss. He, I'm sure, has something to say. He is choosing not to say it. Perhaps on legal advice, perhaps on other advice that we know nothing about. But it's quite clear that this story will continue until it's resolved. The police investigation, which is only at a very preliminary stage, is going to take a long time. The BBC owes a duty to its employee, if that's what he is, contractual staff member, whatever his position may be, and is not going to name him or in any way throw him under a bus. So the question for him is really what he's going to do, and that's presumably what he's thinking about.
We heard the BBC's timeline of events today and the efforts it made to contact the original complainant. 1 email, 1 phone call, no response. And then it was left until the Sun got in touch with the BBC last Thursday. What do you think of that?
I think that the BBC accepts that this was not the best way to handle this. If you look at what Tim Davies said earlier today, the Director General was clearly concerned. He's got an internal BBC review of how this was handled. the question is, if the BBC knew about the seriousness of these allegations at the time when they were first reported, and they simply relied on one email, one phone call, and then put it on hold to see why the family didn't get back to the BBC, well, that may well not have been an adequate response. Equally, you would have thought that the family concerned, having complained to the BBC and not got a response, would have got back to the BBC and said, well, what's happening to our complaint?
Harvey Proctor, are you heartened that this presenter hasn't officially been named?
He must not be named unless the police decide to charge him. That looks at the moment to be a remote possibility, but we believe in this country about anonymity before charge. Let us make sure we stick to that. Let's make sure the BBC sticks to that. Let's make sure the people on the internet stick to that.
Well, that's impossible.
Let's make sure the police stick to that. I know in my case, this did not happen.
Sure.
I was named very quickly. There was no anonymity before charge for myself. I wasn't even charged, but my name was over the headlines of newspapers and, if I may say so, on the BBC radio and television.
I mean, the presenter that we're talking about here may never be charged, of course. We have to wait for the police, the detectives, to do what they call a scoping exercise. As you say, your circumstances were very, very different to those we're discussing at the BBC. You faced very, very serious allegations. There was a police inquiry. Claims that were made against you that were totally false. And in fact, your accuser was jailed for 18 years for perverting the course of justice, for fraud and for child sexual offences.
Well,
what
Mr.
was sorry, let me ask you the question, if I may, Mr. Proctor.
Mr. Rosenberg earlier talked about numbers of complainants and that 2 others had come forward. It's not the number, it's the quality of the evidence, and there's no evidence yet. In my case, when I went on television and radio at a press conference and appealed for anybody who had credible and true evidence to come forward, 2 others came forward. The Metropolitan Police did not investigate them, but now after all these years, these 2, known as witness A and B, are currently being investigated by West Midlands Police for perverting the course of justice.
OK,
so
let me play a clip of you from that press conference.
Numbers are not quality, I'm afraid, Mr. Rosenberg. You should know that.
Well, do you want to respond?
I accept that numbers are only numbers, and obviously one wants to see the evidence. So Harvey Proctor is entirely right about that. But we wait to see what happens.
Let's play a clip of you, Mr. Proctor, from that press conference. It was 2015. You called it. You were controlling the narrative. It was to denounce the claims against you. Have a look at this.
I am a homosexual. I'm not a murderer. I'm not a paedophile or pederast. Let me be frank. I pleaded guilty to 4 charges of gross indecency in 1987 relating to the then age of consent for homosexual activity. Those offences are no longer offences as the age of consent has dropped from 21 to 18 to 16.
Why did you decide to take control in that way?
Because I was fed up, as I think the presenter today will be fed up, with people dripping information into the media which had no relevance or no evidential basis. That included the Metropolitan Police, who said my accuser, before they started to investigate, was credible and true. They included the radio and television, and including the BBC. I will leave it at that. Okay. There is, if I may say so, with regard to recent events, Operation Yewtree, Operation Conifer, Operation Midland, the Paul Schofield issue, and the present one, a faint aroma of homophobia along these matters.
Okay, let me bring Joshua back in, if I may. As more information comes out each day, how much strain, how much pressure does that put on the anonymity of the presenter?
It certainly puts a lot of pressure in the way that you've been describing. Just to pick up Harvey Proctor's point about the fact that numbers are only numbers, he's of course right, but don't forget that complainant number 2 was investigated by the BBC. I can't talk about complainant number 3 or complainant number 1 because they spoke to the Sun. But the complainant who was complained to the BBC, those allegations were investigated, phone numbers were checked, and so on. And one has to trust the BBC's.
The BBC, Mr. Rosenberg, you may like to think they should be, but they're not the police.
It's human nature to be curious, Mr. Proctor, to want to find out. There are many, please let me finish. There are many thousands of people on social media who are gossiping. Do you think that people, please let me finish. Do you think that people sometimes forget that there are human beings at the centre of these stories, with families, with, you know?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. I started my comments by saying there are at least two vulnerable people involved in this, the complainant and the alleged suspect. I know personally, without going into details, the pain and hurt that that person will be suffering. I would suggest, knowing what happened to me, if the presenter is innocent, then he should go and throw a press conference at the earliest opportunity and turn the tide of this slanderous tittle-tattle that appears to be about and seems to be engaging everyone in a frenzy.
Okay, thank you both.
It's a frenzy, by the way, that people are using to beat the BBC with this stick, this moral stick. I think it should cease. Leave the police to do their job, and then let's see what happens when the police decide to arrest or not arrest this person.
Okay. Thank you very much for your contribution this evening, Mr. Proctor. We appreciate it. Thank you. Joshua Rosenberg, thank you very much. And of course, goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, we did ask The Sun for an interview, and last night we did as well. And we've invited the editor on tomorrow night as well, so we'll see. Now, if Rishi Sunak needed any evidence of the urgency he faces on his promise to deliver on his pledge to, as he puts it, stop the boats, then the latest data on the number of people who made the Channel crossing might give him pause for thought. 1,600 people arrived into the UK in the last 4 days, bringing the total to more than 13,000 this year. Perhaps then it's understandable just why in the last few hours things have become so heated in the House of Commons, where ministers have gone on the offensive to undo changes made by peers to the government's flagship migration bill. The showdown with the Lords comes against a backdrop of conflict with some of the government's own backbenchers, who believe the government is going too far in some areas, and the opposition, who say the bill won't stop the boats anyway. In a moment, we'll speak live to one of the key Conservative rebels and ask if he's happy with the concessions made by the government. First, here's Nick with the latest. So what's happened tonight, Nick?
Well, Victoria, it was a busy afternoon and early evening in the House of Commons. It was 18 votes in all, and the government comfortably won all of those. As you say, the background was on the government's illegal migration bill. The House of Lords had made a series of changes and the government wanted to overturn those. But in order to set the atmosphere in the last 48 hours or so, they did make some concessions to potential rebels. The main areas were on the detention of pregnant women. The rebels said that the government had completely backed down there. On the retrospective application of the bill and on the detention of unaccompanied minors. And the rebels on that one said that it did not go far enough. So that set the scene for the votes. And it was vote after vote after vote. I was standing in the area where, as a member of the lobby, you are allowed to stand. You can't be in the members' lobby, but you can be in what is known as the Ways and Means corridor. And it's like a motorway. They come round and they go round and they vote, and they come round and they go round. And it was 18 votes in all. One cabinet minister said to me that they thought that it was unprecedented to have this many votes. I think you probably have to go back around 50 years to have that many votes in all one go. Now, there were some rebellions, and the key rebellions were on the detention of unaccompanied minors and on modern slavery. On that one, the modern slavery, the trafficking, Theresa May, she rebelled. That is the first time, as I understand it, that she has rebelled against the Conservative whip. She feels very strongly about it. The word from inside government is that Theresa May, they say, is absolutely right to say that this is unravelling her approach on modern slavery, which is something that she has always campaigned on. Right to say they're unravelling it, and the government say, yeah, we are, because we disagree with her. We believe that this needs to be done. There were these rebellions, but the government, as I was saying, did win comfortably. One member of the cabinet said to me, the elected chamber has spoken. Another minister who's pretty much at the heart of all of this, they said to me, we are not minded to make any more concessions, but another member of the cabinet says it is obviously going to go back to the Lords. Let's see how it works out there, and then maybe there might need to be some more concessions.
Anything else, or is that it?
Well, it then goes back to the House of Lords.
Where do we go from
and
here, then?
because it's ping pong, so it's come back to the Commons, it goes back to the Lords. My instinct is that in the Lords they might have another go. They might hope for some more concessions on things like the detention of unaccompanied minors. But the core group of the crossbenchers, that's the former judges, they probably won't want to go to the wire on this. And interestingly, the Labour Party, if they took this to the wire, the bill might run out of time, might not make it to the statute book by the summer. And would the Labour Party want to be accused of kiboshing this bill? Because what Labour is saying is the problem with this bill is it doesn't work. And if they are seen to have kiboshed it, then the Conservative government could turn that round on them.
Right. Thank you, Nick. Thank you. Let's talk now to Conservative MP, former Minister Tim Loughton. Hello to you.
Good evening.
Have you ever voted 18 times before in one go?
I don't think I have. We were trying to think the last time. Apparently, 1971, the Industrial whatever act it was, they voted more times. That was a bit before my time. So unprecedented, but we're very efficient. 18 votes in 3.5 hours. It was a bit of a conveyor belt, as Nick says.
Yeah, I mean, what does the fact that there were 18 votes on this in one go tell us about this legislation?
It was always going to be a controversial piece of legislation. Some really sensitive issues in it, particularly around detention of children, detention of pregnant women. That's been resolved, I hope, today. The House of Lords really took it to task. They were always going to. So to send 20 amendments back to the House of Commons is a lot. So I don't think they are going to say, OK, fine, you've had your say, we'll cave in. There are several more days next week when it can come back to us. And of course, they can play ping pong for as long as they like. And if they play it for long enough, it will be the other side of the summer recess. And the government wants to get this legislation through, quite understandably, before the summer recess. So there'll be a bit of brinkmanship, I think, still to come next week.
Do you have a message for the peers?
The message for the peers is I think there are certain key issues, and they were the amendments which I voted against the government on, around child detention. They've come some way. They've got it down to 8 days rather than 28 days for some children.
What do you want?
Well, I think the question marks of how you look after those children. They need to be in appropriate accommodation with appropriate services, particularly if they are young children. There's a big grey area about age-disputed people. There's a lot of them.
Can I come back to the child detention? Okay. Are you comfortable with 8 days?
I think 8 days, the government actually have that power already. The question is whether you look after them appropriately in age-appropriate accommodation.
Right. I.e. whether there's access to adults in that accommodation.
And whether they can very quickly go through to foster care, normal way we look after them.
But according to the Refugee Council, there's still no statutory limit, no legal limit on the length of time an unaccompanied child asylum seeker can be detained.
So that is the point. So although the government has said that it will come down to 8 days for certain states of children, actually it doesn't cover all children. So what we want to see...
So some children can be detained indefinitely?
They can be detained for 8 days with a view to them being deported. But for children coming into the country, technically it can be indefinitely. They can then go to apply for bail, but that's not guaranteed. There's still lots of question marks there. That's why this has got to be absolutely sorted out. Children should only be detained if it's in their interest, if there's a risk of them absconding, and for the least possible time. Then they should be looked after as any other child is in this country. If we get those sorts of assurances with some more detail on the face of the bill, then I think we can come to some agreement on this. But as it stands at the moment, there are too many question marks still. And we are talking about potentially, there were 5,200 asylum-seeking children last year, unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. This is quite a lot of children potentially to deal with.
Yeah, and as a former children's minister, you will know that everyone can see that an unaccompanied child getting off a boat on a pretty traumatic journey without parents around them, going to be absolutely terrified, aren't they?
Sure, but let's distinguish. There are young children that clearly need absolutely maximum support, and that's they need to be put in some form of children's home foster care, as we would a child that needs care in this country. The trouble is, a lot of the people coming across are older teenagers or young men in their 20s claiming to be under the age of 18. And that's where the problem is, how you can determine whether they generally are children or not in as swift as possible time. It's taking too long. They need to do much more about that. We need to make sure that adults are separated from genuine children in the meantime. So this is complicated, but the government needs to give more assurances, and then it will get the legislation through.
Let's talk about victims of modern slavery. Nick said, the government says the bill will enable more perpetrators to be stopped. Theresa May says it will do the exact opposite. They can't both be right.
I agreed with Theresa May. The modern-day slavery legislation was one of the hallmarks of her term in office. It's well-beating legislation, and I think it's something we should be proud of. There are problems with this new bill that effectively could undermine some of those victims, that they would effectively be deported before they could apply to the national referral mechanism, which then assesses if they are in danger, but crucially can then take evidence from them to try and capture the traffickers, the smugglers who put them in that position in the first place. So we need them to be seen as victims, if they generally are victims, and help in closing down the perpetrators and these criminal gangs. There's a risk under this legislation that they could be deported or go underground before they have a chance to do that. So I think Theresa is right. I think this is easily resolved. I think the government needs to be a bit more proactive on giving some concessions over the next few days, and then again, everyone will rally behind it.
The Immigration Minister said in the Commons today some of the amendments, some of the changes to the bill that have been made in the House of Lords before it came back to you were actually about generally just wrecking it.
They were. Absolutely.
Do you agree with him?
I do. Look,
but not the amendments you want. They're not about wrecking it.
Not our amendments.
Well,
no.
that's a funny thing, isn't it?
There are three main areas where the government needs to do better. That's on detention of children.
But just a minute. Why are the amendments you support not undermining it?
Because the government has already given way on safe and legal routes. We want to beef it up to make sure we can get it quicker.
Doesn't want to give away on modern slavery.
On child detention, they've already made some concessions. We want them to go further with safeguards around appropriate age-appropriate accommodation. On modern-day slavery, I think the government is just wrong. There were many other amendments coming from the Lords, which were all about taking out whole chunks of the bill, which were wrecking amendments. The Liberal Democrats wanted to wreck the bill entirely. They didn't get it their way. But those are three main genuine areas of concern where the government can do better, and we hope they will.
Even when this becomes law, you cannot put anyone on a plane to go to Rwanda because it's tied up in the courts. So the whole thing is performative, just so you can say, yeah, we're going to stop the boats. You can't. OK, well, you can't not put anybody on a plane. There are certain returns agreements where people can be returned. We need more of those returns agreements. There's also question marks about those people coming over who will now be subject to detention. Physically, where are you going to put them? Because we have a shortage of places to put them now, which is why so many people are in hotels. Hotels are not secure. Yeah. So the government knows that it's actually got to do a lot of work more to make this bill practically enforceable as well, which is why... you have to wait for the appeal at the Supreme Court, which could be next year. The Rwanda scheme is just one part of no, I know. That's the bit I'm talking about. You can't put people on a plane to Rwanda. When the Rwanda scheme eventually goes to the Supreme Court, which hopefully will be this autumn, if it gets up and running quickly, that can be a very clear deterrent. And we know it's a deterrent. Then the whole thing then the government
needs to be looking, as it is at the moment, at alternatives to the Rwanda scheme. Rwanda is not the only country in the frame at the moment.
Yeah. You've got one other agreement, but there's no one else coming forward.
But Victoria, what I think is really important, so when the Home Affairs Select Committee went to Calais earlier in the year, spoke to all the authorities there, the really interesting thing they said to us is when the Rwanda scheme was announced by the government last year, there was a surge in people in Calais looking to come across the channel who went to the French authorities to try and regularise their status in France because they didn't want to risk going to Rwanda. It would become a lottery if you're in a hotel in Kent or on a plane to Rwanda. So we know it acts as a deterrent, but only when it starts. And of course it hasn't started, so the deterrent effect has fizzled out.
Although we recently had the economic assessment from the Home Office which said it was uncertain about the deterrent effect. It didn't know.
Well, I've just given you a very clear example of how it was.
Yeah, I'm just telling you what the Home Office's own assessment of this bill.
And I'm telling you what the French authorities, who is
well, they didn't mention
vast
that.
majority
they
of
didn't
these
mention
people
that in the
coming
economic
from.
assessment.
Well, OK, we saw them face to face.
Can I ask you finally about the painting over of the Mickey Mouse mural at the reception centre for child asylum seekers in Dover? Painted over by order of the immigration minister, reportedly because he believed these murals sent too welcoming a message. Is that going to stop the boats?
No, and if it had been my choice, I wouldn't have done it. I think it's probably unwise, sends out the wrong messages, and I should think the minister probably regrets it now.
Why do you think he probably regrets it? What gives you that idea?
Because it's a minor issue which has now been blown out of all proportion, and that will now be attached to his name.
Why do you think he did it?
I don't know. You'll have to ask him. If I was in his position, I wouldn't have done it.
Thank you very much for being here tonight. Sorry about the transport problems as well. Thank you. In the last few minutes, the UK government's revealed that the G7 is expected to announce what's described as a significant international framework for Ukraine's long-term security arrangements at the NATO summit tomorrow. Now, Downing Street has even suggested it could be a major step towards ending the war. Obviously, that sounds pretty positive for Ukraine. And yet President Zelensky today has struck a very different tone. Mark is here. So tell us a bit more about this announcement, Mark.
Well, this is the coordinated announcement between NATO, the military alliance, and G7, the economic group. It is, as you say, about a framework. I think the most interesting phrase we got from Downing Street is about security guarantees to Ukraine in the event of any future attacks. So it would seem some sorts of promises of action if Ukraine does stop the current hostilities with Russia about preventing a future occurrence of a similar kind of conflict. Obviously, today what we got is further details of military assistance, suggestions that they could be fast-tracked into NATO, summed up by Jens Stoltenberg at the summit. Let's have a listen.
What allies have agreed today is a strong, united and positive message to Ukraine about enduring support, but also a positive message on the path forward for membership. There has never been a stronger message from NATO at any time, both when it comes to the political message on the path forward for membership and the concrete support from NATO allies, military support, but also the practical support on how to ensure full interoperability.
Well, what he didn't say is when Ukraine can join NATO. And in theory, the invitation has been on the table for 15 years. So it will disappoint a lot of Ukrainians, that aspect of it.
Tell us more about Ukraine's response to what's coming out of the summit then.
Well, I think seeing the way things were going on his way there, Volodymyr Zelensky tweeted this morning quite emotive language that he used. I don't know if we can have a look at that. But the key phrase in there was that by not giving them membership right now, NATO was effectively leaving on the table the possibility of ruling it out in a negotiation with Russia. In other words, selling out the Ukrainians in that sense, in their aspiration for NATO membership as part of the price of peace. So fascinating to see that frustration from President Zelensky coming out into the open.
OK. Mark, we're going to leave it there because we're going to talk to a former defence minister of President Zelensky. His name is Andrei Zagorodnyuk, chairman of the Centre for Defence Strategies and former minister, as I said, of Defence of Ukraine. Joining us from Kyiv. Hello to you, sir. Thank you very much for talking to our audience. Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky, threatening earlier that he won't attend the NATO summit if there isn't some kind of concrete timeline for Ukraine joining NATO. But he hasn't got what he wanted. Has he failed?
It's a question whether he failed or just the situation is that NATO cannot provide any specific plan to Ukraine, and that's probably what's happening. And obviously, this is frustrating because NATO is a little bit self-contradictory, I have to say, in its own words. So if we look, for example, at communique, which was published today, the Article 11 is about Ukraine, and it's about Ukrainian membership and Ukraine seeking membership. And what it says is that we fully support Ukraine's right to choose its own security arrangements, Ukraine's future in NATO, Ukraine will be a member. Ukraine already went a long way in its reform and, building up military. So there is no membership action plan required, which means there is no condition precedent. And then at the end of the same article, they say that Ukraine can enter into negotiations when the allies agree and when the conditions are met. So question is, what conditions are met? And if allies haven't agreed yet, so why do we have these positive statements in the beginning? So essentially, it's what in the law it's called agreement to agree, which is a paradox, and it doesn't make much sense, to be honest. And that's what frustrated, because it's basically we are kind of walking around the membership idea. We're walking around the.
Well, let me ask you, if I may.
I'm not saying anything specific.
Sure, not saying anything specific. So, do you want a specific date? A date?
To be honest, I mean, President never asked for a date, because the date obviously would be related to some event, and it's very difficult to estimate the event. President never asked. He obviously suggested that it's great if Ukraine accepted straight away, and we'll agree with this, of course. But it's probably unrealistic to expect. So
yeah, because the war's still going on, and you wouldn't expect Western other members to sign up to that and get involved in it.
And Article 5, by the way, of NATO Charter doesn't assume that the countries have to send the troops in the country. What it says is that they should provide a reasonable and the best possible response. Since we received so much support from the NATO countries, some people can argue that we already received what we would have received if we were a NATO member. But nevertheless. So we didn't demand a membership, and we didn't demand a specific timeline or the date or anything like this. The question is that we needed at least something concrete, and that concrete didn't show up. And that's and more than that, we received a verbiage which was self-contradictory even in one clause of the agreement.
You did get something. Sorry to interrupt. You did get something concrete today, not on NATO, but on the F-16 partnership.
Yeah, but that's a different story.
It is. But I'm just saying it was something concrete.
No. Yeah, of course. That wasn't part of the membership discussion. The F-16 partnership was a discussion for some time, and it wasn't with the NATO's organization. That was with a number of countries. And basically, they agreed about the support on the margins of NATO conference. And indeed, the fact that we received so much support from Western allies is huge, and we're extremely grateful for that, because this would allow us to fight. So there's no doubt about that.
Okay.
What we've been just discussing is the membership story, so to speak.
Thank you very much, sir. Thanks for talking to us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, mortgage rates today reached a level not seen since the 2008 financial crisis, higher than even in the aftermath of Liz Truss's calamitous mini-budget. Bank bosses were hauled in front of MPs today to account for the impact of such rates on homeowners. Mortgage rates are going up because the Bank of England is putting up its own base rate to bring down inflation, and further hikes are expected. But some economists are questioning whether the reliance only on interest rates to tackle inflation is either fair or wise. Should the government be looking at taking action elsewhere? Here's Ben.
City traders expect interest rates to rise even higher after the pound dropped to a record low this morning.
We thought we'd left this behind.
Tonight, a number of banks and lenders have stopped offering new mortgages because of the volatility in the currency markets.
But are we now back in the same mess? 2-year and 5-year average mortgage rates spiked above 6% after Liz Truss's mini-budget, which helped end her premiership. But today, those rates are back to and even above those punishing rates seen last autumn, at 6.66% for a 2-year fix and 6.17% for a 5-year one. Some Liz Truss supporters have suggested we've got the excruciating mortgage rates, but none of the growth-boosting tax cuts that she put forward. So the worst of both worlds.
Aren't you going to say sorry?
But that's rather misleading. The economic context today is very different. Mortgage rates today are rising not because of a sense in markets that the government has lost control of borrowing, as was the case last autumn, but rather because of the strong expectation that the Bank of England is going to have to raise interest rates several more times to deal with the UK's sticky inflation problem. The reality is reflected in the value of sterling. As you can see here, the pound was sinking fast against the US dollar last autumn, but now it's strengthening. But nevertheless, those mortgage rates will be just as painful as they were last autumn for those affected. As we've highlighted on Newsnight, the economic pain is being and will be increasingly visited on 7 million mortgaged households. But what's interesting is that some economists are suggesting an alternative approach. If the goal of raising interest rates is to bring down inflation by reducing consumer spending and to thereby slow the economy, why not do some of that job by raising taxes or perhaps by cutting public spending? In other words, if fiscal policy as well as monetary policy were put into action against inflation, interest rates might not need to rise so high. Plus, the government could make the impact of the necessary adjustment more socially equitable. Now, this isn't something that really figures at all in the current party political debate, but it is worth exploring.
The people who are affected most by higher interest rates would tend to be younger households. Older people, older householders are more likely to have paid off their mortgages, they're mortgage free, so they don't feel the impact of the increase in mortgage rates. You could spread the pain more broadly, so those households that perhaps aren't facing higher mortgage rates currently, households that don't hold mortgages, would potentially contribute towards the squeeze in demand by paying higher taxation. You could argue for a property tax, for example.
Yet there are also practical problems with using tax and spending policy to control inflation. History suggests it's hard to get the timing right. When it comes to tax and spending, political considerations often interfere unhelpfully. That's why the practice in recent decades has been to leave inflation control to the independent Bank of England. However, there is certainly more open thinking going on among respectable economists about these questions. And as mortgage rates go higher, putting a very large burden on a relatively small section of society, expect this debate about whether there are alternatives to intensify.
That's all from us tonight. I'll see you again tomorrow. Good night.